Welcome back to the workbench. In the previous episode, I looked at joining the fuselage onto the wing assembly that I've created. But in this episode, it's time to start getting some paint onto the aircraft and making it look like an actual plane, and not just a big grey blob. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me for episode 3 of the 1/24 scale Grumman F6F Hellcat from Airfix. So far, this is turning out to be quite the project. So let's continue with this build. As with the other episodes in the series, I'll pop a list of the various products I've been using during this particular section of the build. This should help give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go out and get if you fancy building this one for yourself. So in the previous video, I got to this kind of stage. The fuselage and wings are pretty much complete. However, there are a few bits and pieces which still need to be added. I realised that I forgot to add the ailerons in the previous episode. These are relatively easy to assemble, however, coming in only a couple of parts. I also neglected to attach the landing flaps as well. Again though, they come in a couple of halves which just need to be glued together. There are these extra components which need to be glued into place, and these were attached to the relevant places on the aircraft. The ailerons were carefully glued into place on the relevant wings, and so too were the landing flaps. As mentioned in the previous video, I've decided to glue mine in the lowered position. However, you can glue these in the raised position, but you would have had to plan that previously, as the parts for this need to be glued in before the wings are assembled. As mentioned in the previous episode, I do want to have some bombs on the bottom of this aircraft. The pylons for this need to be glued together. Again, this has a simple design, the pylons being glued together and then the mounting rack glued into the pylons. And with that done, I glued them into the relevant holes which I had opened up in episode 2. I'm also going to glue together the landing gear. The landing gear legs come in 2 parts and these were glued together, and then these were glued into their slots on the relevant landing gear bays. I've decided to glue these various parts in here as there's no point painting them separately as they're all going to be the same colour. Some more elements of the landing gear can be installed. In particular, these other small components which go at the front of the legs, they were a little bit fiddly, but it is possible to get them in the right place. The landing gear covers were glued onto the sides of the legs, and this small one at the front. I have gone out and bought myself an accessory for this kit, and this is the Eduard mask set. I've been really enjoying pre-cut masks recently as they just make things a little bit quicker and simpler to do. The mask set features all of the masks for the clear parts that I'll need, and it was a simple matter to peel them off from the backing paper and stick them onto the relevant panels. I don't typically work with glazing this large though, and I did find applying the tape to be a little bit tricky. It sounds counterintuitive, but I actually find it easier to place the tape when the windows are smaller. This mask set doesn't cover everything though, and there are areas where I need to use some liquid mask, so some Vallejo liquid mask was used for this. I brushed it onto the relevant areas which needed this extra coating, and it would then be left to dry. Humbrol Clear Fix is a glue which dries clear and strong without risk of fogging up the plastic. It is a little bit stringy though, so I have to be careful with its placement. I use this glue to attach the cockpit windscreen to the front of the aircraft. I won't be gluing on the main cockpit canopy though, because I actually need to paint the area where it's going to be positioned. So I'll leave this part off for now, and we'll have to mask the cockpit area so paint doesn't go inside it. I decided to glue in the aerial mast, and then it was time to fill some gaps. I'm using a combination of the putty surfacer medium and Humbrol model filler, depending on my needs at the time and the size of the gap. As mentioned in the previous episode, some of the fits of the parts are a little bit tricky at times and can kind of snowball if you don't get things in the right place and leave gaps later on. Along the leading edges of the wings and where the fuselage meets the wings, some of this surfacer putty was applied. That larger gap I mentioned in the previous episode needed some of the model filler. This was pushed into the gaps and then everything would be sanded down to make it look a little bit neater. This step is being conducted now so that I don't have to come back to do any of this after I've started painting. So with the cockpit mast as mentioned, to prevent any spray from going inside of there, the first thing to do was to use this Outlaw interior green on the cockpit components. This should act to kind of allow the internal cockpit colour to appear through the canopy framework from the inside. I also use this to tidy up any areas which I may have used some filler on, and those areas which may be outstanding and actually just require some of this colour. With that done, there are gun bay panels which can be used to display the gun bays in a closed configuration. I don't want mine to be closed, but I do want to mask them in the painting process. So these are not glued in place, they're just placed in position to help protect all of that work I did in the gun bays in the previous episode. So up first in this little painting adventure, I'm going to be using some Outlaw Black. I haven't actually bothered to prime the aircraft, as I find that the acrylic lacquer paints I'm using tend to just stick to the plastic really well. So this black paint is going to be used to add an element of pre-shading to the aircraft. I sprayed black lines on all of the joins where the panels would join, and other various areas to try and give a bit more shading, which might show through the next layers of paint as appropriate. And having done that, and it took quite a while, with some of the work being done off camera, I moved on to this RAF white. So during this build, as I mentioned in the first episode, it was actually voted for by you guys on the channel that I should do the Fleet Air Arm paint scheme. Now interestingly, this kit comes with 4 paint schemes. So you can see the paint schemes here on the box artwork. We've got an American one, we've got another American one, and we've got a French one. And these are all in an overall blue kind of colour. You know, perhaps this one might need the white bands painted on it, but generally speaking, they're all one colour, which is a simpler kind of paint scheme to do. But when I put this up for the vote, you guys all voted for that. You voted for the more complicated paint scheme, and well, let's give it a go. Let's see what happens. Granted, it will be a little bit more work for me to do, but hopefully it will look okay in the end. So to start off with, there are some white panels on the wings and tail of this aircraft that need to be painted. I do like to work from a lighter colour to a darker colour. I find it easier to paint darker colours over light rather than the other way around. So I airbrushed this paint onto the relevant areas, working up the opacity as I needed. I would spend quite a bit of time just making sure that I could make the sort of pre-shading that I've done look kind of convincing. And when that was done, they were appropriately masked with some masking tape to protect them from the next layers of paint. Again, I'm working from light to dark, so I'm going for the RAF beige green next. This is the lower side colour of the aircraft, and is the colour that I've previously used in the landing gear bays. Again, this was built up to sort of preserve that effect of the pre-shading whilst making it look a little bit more subtle, helping to add a bit of tonal variation to the paint scheme. This was applied over all of the lower surfaces of the aircraft. With that done, the next darkest colour is the RAF Dark Slate Grey, again another Outlaw paint. So for these camouflage colours on the top, you can see that I've already masked some of the areas where I don't want the paint to go, particularly along the edges of the wings and where it meets the fuselage, and then I just decided that I would paint them on sort of freehand. Once again, taking my time to build up the opacity of these colours as appropriate. I did find masking the area around the fuselage to be a little bit tricky, which is why I did it off camera. Seeing as this model is quite large and working in a small space that I do find I have to do a few things off camera because I literally can't bend the right way to get the camera to point at the thing that I needed to point at. So masking this was one of those steps. It's quite good that these lacquer paints dry as quickly as they do, because by the time you've done one section you can actually move back to a previous one and apply more paint as needed. And to finish the paint scheme, the last colour I need is some dark sea grey, again another outlaw paint. And this was applied in exactly the same way, completely freehand, and building up the opacity of the paint until I had an effect I was happy with. It is worth mentioning that throughout this build I've been using a Gallery Mobius 0.3 airbrush. It seems to be perfectly acceptable for the work that I've been doing during this build, and the lacquer paints going through this were quite easy to clean out. I did use some lacquer thinner just to run through, and then I could use other cleaning solutions in order to just finish off the job. But generally speaking, I found this airbrush to be completely acceptable. Full transparency, this was a free sample provided for review purposes, but these opinions I'm expressing are completely my own. Generally speaking, the pressures that I was using in my compressor were between 12 and 15 psi, as requested by Outlaw themselves. But at times I would drop that pressure as needed based on what I was doing. And with that all done, it was time to start removing that masking tape. There were some small areas that just needed a little bit of tidying up here and there, but generally speaking, there was no paint bleed and I was really happy with how this was starting to look. Although this is the slightly more complicated paint scheme, I'm actually quite pleased I went with it in the end. It's starting to look quite an interesting model. To help seal in all of this paint and to prepare the surface for some decals, I decided I would use this Army Painter satin varnish rattle can. Because I work in quite a confined space, as you can probably tell it's not the biggest space in the world, and I do have a face mask and I have an open window and I have a extractor spray booth, it does get a little bit fumy in here at times, so I do try and spray as much as I can outside to avoid inhaling anything that I shouldn't. So with that in mind, I took the aircraft outside and gave it a few good coats of this satin varnish, which should give a good surface layer for the decals to stick to in a little bit. I think it is probably worth mentioning as well that this aircraft is so large that I couldn't actually get it to fit within my spray booth anymore. So if I'm working on it like this, it will have to go outside. So now, moving on to the decals. The decals come on a rather large sheet because naturally it's a large scale and a relatively large aircraft, but also because there are 4 paint schemes in there. So I did take my time to cut the relevant transfers away from the sheet as needed. And when I was ready to use them, they were soaked in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. I'm going to be using micro scale, micro set and sol as my setting solutions in this step of the build. First up, the micro set from the blue bottle. This was brushed onto the relevant areas where the transfers were going to be applied. This should help soften them and help them stick onto the surface of the plastic. The decals were slid off of their backing paper and then carefully positioned. Some more micro set could be applied as necessary to help soften them onto the surface. I would repeat this process for all of the transfers that needed to go onto the model at this point. There are quite a few tiny little stencils which are a little bit fiddly, but with some patience and care you can get them in the right places. I found the serial numbers on the side of the aircraft to be a little bit troublesome, not because they tore or folded up or anything like that, but purely because they're a little bit smaller than I was expecting. It doesn't mean that they're the wrong scale, they are scaled correctly as far as I can tell. It's just that they were a little bit more difficult to get sort of aligned correctly. But generally speaking, the decal application phase went without any major incidents. And when all of those decals had been applied and the micro set had done some of its magic, the micro sol from the red bottle was then applied over the top to further soften them and enhance the effect. The effect, of course, being that they look as though they were painted on rather than just water slide transfers. Repeated applications of these solutions should help to prevent any silvering from appearing in the decal film. And I think by the end of the build, I had managed to avoid silvering for about 99% of these transfers. There are a few little areas later on which look ever so slightly as though they may have silvered, but only in certain angles and in certain lights. So on the whole, yeah, pretty happy with my decal application process. And with that, it brings us towards the end of the episode. Granted, you guys voted to see the slightly more complicated paint scheme, and actually I quite like the way it looks. Granted, I didn't use any primer. It didn't really matter because those acrylic lacquer paints have stuck to the plastic really well. That pre-shading as well, I don't generally do pre-shading, but I'm quite happy with the way it's looking, and the transfers seem to have been applied really nicely too. One thing that is probably worth mentioning is that having left the transfers to cure for a little while, I did actually go and put a final coat of the varnish over the top just to help seal them in and prevent them from moving or yellowing or fading whilst I'm still working on this kit. I'm really happy with how this is starting to look now. It went from being quite a challenging build to now actually I feel like I've made progress and it's starting to look like the thing that it should start to look like. This was probably one of the more interesting steps because I've managed to use some new products in this episode which I hadn't tried before, and those outlaw paints are actually quite impressive. With a good level of opacity, the colours seem to be really accurate and they dry incredibly fast, which means you can make good progress. However, as mentioned, I would prefer to use them outside because I don't really want to be breathing in lacquer fumes. And on a project of this size, I'm going to have to start thinking about how I paint it because it just doesn't fit inside my spray booth. As with the other episodes in the series, I have been keeping my notes in my book, just writing them down as I go through to keep track of what I've been doing. But generally, there's nothing in here that particularly screams out at me as being new or not previously mentioned. It just says here that, you know, test the fit, because you might have gaps, and that comes from the earlier part where I was finalizing the little bits of assembly for this video. But I have no comments about the painting, so it was a relatively stress-free experience, and the decals were good to apply as well. And with that, it's probably time to finish this episode. Make sure you subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss the next episode. In part 4, I'm going to be building and painting the engine assembly. And yes, that does warrant its own video by itself because it's got quite a lot going on in it. So make sure you stick around for that one. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen. If you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description for more information. There are other ways to help support the channel too as well, and if you'd like to do so, again, full information is under the video. As mentioned though, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the next episode, and do let me know what you think of my build down in the comments. Finally though, from me at the workbench today, it's a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you again next time. Hellcat Part 3. Oh, that was really loud. Right next to my ear. Of the 124... No, that's not right. It's not 124 scale, is it? Such a big box. As with the